Chapter 12 What She Was. He started with the records. Not because he expected them to tell him what he wanted to know. Official records never told you what you wanted to know. They told you what the system had decided was worth recording, which was a very different thing. But because it was where a detective started, and he was still, underneath everything, a detective. He pulled Raven's file on the wall display in his workspace. It was thinner than Aldous', which told him something. People who opposed the administration tended to have thinner files, not because they did less but because the system recorded less about them, the bureaucratic equivalent of turning away. What the file told him, her name before the transfer had been Raven also, she had kept it, which was a choice some transfers made and others didn't, and the choice said something about what you wanted to carry forward. She had been born in a city that no longer existed in a country that had reorganized itself several times since her death into something with a different name and different borders. She had died at 61. She had transferred within the standard window. The transfer technology required the process to begin before certain biological thresholds were crossed, which meant that the very old and the very sick often missed it, which was another thing the policy documents described in clean language. She had been a human rights lawyer for 22 years, as she'd told him. Before that, she'd spent 6 years in a different kind of law, corporate, well compensated, and then something had shifted, and she'd left and retrained and spent the rest of her biological life doing the harder, less compensated work. He looked at the gap, 6 years of one thing and then a shift to something else entirely. In his experience, gaps like that had a story inside them, a case, a person, a moment of seeing something that couldn't be unseen. The file didn't tell him what it was. He closed the file and went to the blocks. Maren was at her table. It was earlier than he'd come before, and the market was in the process of becoming itself, tables being set up, goods being arranged, the social machinery of the morning running its preliminary operations. Maren was already fully operational, which he was beginning to understand was simply her default state. She looked at him when he arrived, assessed, poured something hot into a cup from a vessel on the table and held it out without being asked. He took it. It was not coffee. The flavor was from a different part of the botanical world entirely. But it was hot and it was real, and he held it with both hands. "You want to know about Raven," Maren said. "If people will talk to me." "They'll talk." She looked at the market filling around them. "She spent 2 years in and out of here. You don't do that without leaving a shape in things." The boy with the sharp eyes found him first, which he was beginning to think was simply how it worked with the boy. He materialized when something was happening that he'd decided was his business. "You were with Raven yesterday," the boy said, "near the wall." "I was," Clover said. "Is she all right?" He looked at the boy. At the sharp eyes and the self-possessed face and the careful way the question had been constructed. Not what's wrong with her, but is she all right? The more disciplined version that didn't admit to already knowing the answer might not be good. He started again. "She's herself," he said, "completely herself." The boy absorbed this. "She taught me to read better," he said. "I could already read but not fast. She brought books, not the approved ones from the drop system, real books, old ones." He paused. "She said reading fast was less important than reading everything." "She's right." "I know," a pause. "She also fixed the water outlet on our block, the one that had been slow for 2 years. She knew how it worked and she fixed it." He said this with the particular admiration reserved for people who could do practical things well. "She didn't make a thing of it, she just fixed it." Clover looked at him. "What's your name?" "Seb," the boy said. "Seb, did she ever talk to you about herself, about before she came to the blocks?" Seb considered this with the honesty of someone who took questions seriously. "She said she used to argue for people, in the official way with the rules and the rooms. She said she got good at it and then the rules stopped working." A pause. "She said when the rules stop working you have to decide what you're actually for." Clover drank from the cup. The not coffee was better than he'd expected. "Did she tell you what she decided?" "She was here, wasn't she?" Seb said, with the logic of someone for whom the answer was self-evident. Then he peeled away into the market, already moving toward whatever was next on his agenda. A woman named Petra had lived in the blocks for 30 years, and had the quality of someone who had seen enough of everything that very little surprised her anymore, which she wore as a kind of relaxed authority. She found Clover near the eastern wall, where he'd stopped to look at a section of the block's improvised infrastructure. Pipes and conduits running along the building faces in patterns that were purely functional and accidentally beautiful. Raven helped design some of that, Petra said, following his gaze. The infrastructure. 3 years ago there was a problem with the heating distribution. Winter, real cold, people getting sick. The official drops included some repair materials, but nobody in here had the technical knowledge to use them properly. She looked at the pipes. Raven came through the gate with food and found people trying to fix it and sat down and figured it out. Took her 2 days. She slept here those 2 nights. A pause. On a floor in someone's front room under a borrowed blanket. Clover looked at the pipes. At the functional and accidentally beautiful lines of them running along the old walls. She didn't need to sleep, he said. No, Petra said, but she did. She said it helped her think. She looked at him sidelong. I always thought she did it because she wanted to know what it felt like, to need to sleep somewhere and have someone give you a blanket. He was quiet for a moment. What was she like, he said, in those 2 days? Petra was quiet too, in the way of someone going back to something. Present, she said finally. That's the word. She was when she was here, she was completely here, no part of her somewhere else. A pause. Most of the ones who come through the gate from the other side, and there aren't many, but there have been some over the years, they're always partly somewhere else, you can feel it. They're here, but they're also calculating or observing or managing their own discomfort at being here. She shook her head. Not Raven, when she was here she was just here. Because she wanted to be, Clover said. Because she needed to be, Petra said. There's a difference. He looked at the improvised pipes. At the heating distribution that kept 30 years of accumulated life warm in the cold, fixed by a human rights lawyer who slept on someone's floor under a borrowed blanket, because she wanted to know what it felt like. Has she been different lately, he said, the last few weeks? Petra was quiet for a moment that told him something. She came through the gate about a month ago, Petra said, with food, the good kind, the kind from the real suppliers, not the drops, more than usual. She walked the whole blocks, spent time with everyone who wanted to spend time with her. A pause. She helped Marin's granddaughter choose a name for the baby. What name did they choose? Petra looked at him. Raven, she said. He looked at the wall. At the concrete of it, the 8 meters that divided the city from itself, the instrument of a decision that had been made about who belonged where. She knew she wasn't coming back, he said. I think so, Petra said quietly. I think she came to say goodbye without saying it, the way people do. A pause. We knew, the ones who'd known her long enough. We knew, and we didn't say anything because some things you let a person do their own way. He turned and looked at her. Are you angry? Petra looked at the question with the steady honesty she'd applied to everything else. I'm going to be, she said. When it's real, right now it doesn't quite feel real yet. A pause. She was good to us, better than she needed to be, better than anyone from the other side has ever been. She looked at him with the direct eyes of someone who had decided he could handle what she was about to say. But she was also in pain. You could feel that too if you knew her. Underneath the presence, underneath all of it, she was very tired. He nodded once. The baby, he said, Marin's granddaughter's baby. What about her? She's going to grow up in here, he said, inside the wall. Yes, Petra said. Unless something changes. Petra looked at him with the steady eyes. Are you going to change something, she said. He thought about the paper in his workspace, the notes accumulating in his specific handwriting, the true report that Vane had told him the system couldn't act on. I'm going to try, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded, not with warmth exactly, not with skepticism exactly. With the considered fairness of someone who had heard promises before and had developed a precise instrument for measuring their weight. All right, she said, and walked back into the market. He found Marin before he left. She was back at her table, the morning's business in full operation around her, and she looked at him with the eyes that had been running their assessment since he first walked through the gate and had apparently reached some kind of conclusion. She talked about you, Marin said. Clover stopped before she met me. After the first time. She came through the gate 2 days later and she said she'd met the frozen detective and that she said he was the right kind of difficult. Marin's expression had the quality of someone quoting something exactly. She said he asked the right questions and didn't like the answers and kept going anyway. He looked at the table, at the goods arranged on it with the practical care of someone who had been making the most of limited resources for a very long time. What was she like, he said. Before the blocks, before all of this, when she first got here. Marin tilted her head. I didn't know her then, but she told me once that she'd spent the first years in this city feeling like she was watching herself from the outside. Like the thing walking around and talking and doing the administrative work was her but not quite, a very good copy that had all the information but none of the, she paused, searching, none of the weight. She said flesh has weight, not the physical kind, the kind that means things matter because they cost you something. And coming here gave it back, Clover said. Coming here reminded her what the weight was for, Marin said. Not the same thing, but close enough to matter. She looked at him steadily. She loved the people in these blocks, Mr. Clover. I don't mean that in the soft sense. I mean she loved them the way a person loves something when the loving has been tested and came back true every time. He stood at the table and felt the grief doing what grief did, which was arrive ahead of the event and set up residence. I know, he said. Marin reached under the table and produced a cloth-wrapped package. She held it out. He looked at it. What is this? Bread, she said. For tomorrow, she asked me to make it. The steady eyes. She told me you'd be coming to the market in the morning. She told me to make sure you ate something. He took the package. It was warm. He held it with both hands the way he'd held the cup of not coffee, and stood in Marin's market, while the blocks did their living around him, and thought about a woman who had arranged for bread to be waiting for him the morning after whatever she was going to do. Because even at the end of things, she was thinking about whether he'd eaten. He walked back to the gate. He stopped outside his residential unit and sat on the step outside it. A step, he realized, that was the same basic thing as the step in the blocks where they'd sat, and she'd asked what he thought happened after, and he'd had no answer. He still had no answer. He thought about the 6 years of corporate law and the shift that had come after, the gap in the file, the story inside the gap that he hadn't been able to find. He didn't need to find it anymore. He understood it without the specifics. He'd known people like that his whole career, people who had seen something that couldn't be unseen and had reorganized themselves around the seeing. The specific incident didn't matter. What mattered was what you did with it. She'd done 22 years of human rights law with it. And then she died and transferred, and found herself in a city that was doing the thing she'd spent 22 years fighting. And she'd done 7 more years of legitimate channels, and then she'd run out. And then she'd done the one last thing. And then she was going to rest. He sat on the step outside his residential unit in the city of the permanent, and held the warm bread, and let the grief be what it was. It was the old kind, he discovered. Like the anger. Patient. It had been waiting the whole investigation to arrive, and now it was here, and it had, apparently, unpacked. He went inside. He sat at the desk. He wrote for a long time.